Hello everyone, welcome back. Today's story is from our /confessions. Okay. Fair warning. This one is long. Apologies for that. But this is very hard for me, and I have been carrying it for a lot of years. On the advice of my therapist, I've written it all out to try to work out my feelings on it. He didn't advise me to submit it to Reddit, of course. But I have struggled with this for a long time, and I need to hear other people's opinion on it. I still really have no idea how I feel about it, even after all these years, but I will submit for judgment by the masses. I know I did wrong on some things, probably a lot of things. I tried to do my best that I could. My son was very troubled. Very troubled. If you have seen the movie We Need to Talk About Kevin, it will really help to understand what I'm talking about, because I swear when I watched that film I thought I was watching a documentary of my life. I felt like the writer must have had cameras hidden in my house, that's how accurate it was. The only difference is that in the movie, the boy appears normal to his father and only reveals his true nature to his mother. With my son he didn't have that mask. His extreme behavior was the same with everyone. From the day he was born, my son just came out wrong. He was planned, my wife and I tried to get pregnant and were ecstatic when he was born. He was wanted and loved. We showered affection on him and really tried to give him a happy childhood. But from the day we brought him home from the hospital, he was miserable. He cried for 13 months straight. I'm not exaggerating, 13 months without a break. He cried until he had no voice left and kept crying. You could see his little face scrunched up and no sound coming out, totally hoarse. There were times he would literally be crying in his sleep. I've never seen or heard of any other kid able to do that. We brought him to doctors, specialists, tried changing his diet, held him, rocked him, toys, swaddling, music, mobiles, everything we could think of. Nothing worked. 13 months of grating, grinding, no sleep difficulty. Once he got over the crying stage, we thought we were out of the woods. But it quickly became clear that for some unknown reason, he was just angry at being alive. I never saw that kid have a genuine, joyous smile once in the time I knew him. I saw him grin a vicious, horrible grin many times, taking a perverse pleasure from causing pain or suffering or breaking a rule, but a smile from real pleasure at something nice? No, never. Not once. He had no interest in anything positive, he was fueled by negativity, and everything he did was bent toward that. As soon as he could walk, his mission in life was to destroy things. He would break or try to break anything that came in his range, smash it, chew it, throw it in the toilet, whatever he could. After a while he figured out how to get his diaper off and took great pleasure in making messes anywhere he could. After a while he figured out he could hide it, and started making messes in places we wouldn't find right away, grinding it into carpets, making it even more of a problem to clean and making the house smell bad. When he got older, ages 9 to 15, he would make messes in our bed, until we got a lock on our door and he wasn't able to get in anymore. Then he'd just make a mess in the hallway in front of our room. That biological warfare started around 2.5 years old and he never grew out of it. I'll try to speed it up as I could literally go on for days about this stuff, but as he grew older, he became more and more unmanageable. He would bite, kick, scream, scratch and spit at anyone trying to do anything with him. He was kicked out of school twice before he was 9, then let him back in and then kicked him out for good. He had to change schools. The next one put him in a special class that kept him away from the other students. We had to install a door and lock on the kitchen because he would steal knives and use them to gouge the walls/furniture or chase people with them. When he was 10, he hurt me pretty badly in the hip and backside. I still have the scars. As he grew older, he grew darker. He moved into setting things on fire, and hurting local animals. There was a stray dog that hung out around the park near our house. My son injured it in one eye with a barbecue fork. He would harm cats. He became a violent, unpleasant, vicious individual that lived in our house. We couldn't do anything with him. I will take this opportunity to preempt that tsunami of messages. Yes, we had the kid in therapy. He saw a psychiatrist twice a week, and had God knows how many different medications prescribed to him over the years. Nothing worked. Therapy didn't work. Meds didn't work. Nothing worked. He was like a cloud of negativity lashing out at anything in his reach. When my son was 16, my wife got pregnant again. I can't tell you how different our reaction was. Instead of joy, we felt horror. This pregnancy had not been planned, and we really were at a loss over what to do. My son had been such an unending nightmare for 16 years, we couldn't take the idea of starting again from the beginning. We talked a lot about terminating, but A, access to termination was not as easy in those days as it is now, and B, my wife was very against it. We talked about many options. In the end, we decided that my wife would have the baby, and if it turned out problematic we would put it up for adoption. We knew we just couldn't do it again with another child like our son. We had a daughter. She was normal. Suddenly we saw what our lives should have been like the whole time, how things would have been had our son not been himself. She laughed at things. She breastfed without biting. She didn't have teeth yet anyway, but you could tell she was just trying to eat, not harm her mom. After 4 months she was sleeping through the night. She was happy. She was normal. I can't describe the relief and happiness that we both felt, I don't have the words for it. This where I believe I may have started really pulling back from my son. Up until that time, whatever mistakes I made, I had always tried to do the best for my son, I am convinced of that. I tried to help him and love him and care for him, I really tried. But when my daughter was born, my wife and I both instinctively just turned toward her. She became our focus, not from malice, but just because she was so much easier. She was so happy and sweet, every moment we were with her was like magic. I understand this was wrong, but we honestly couldn't help it. I don't have a better explanation than that. My son hadn't given a care about my wife being pregnant, I honestly don't know if he really understood it, but when we brought our daughter home he started acting out even more. I didn't think it was possible, but he took it up another notch. At this time he was 17, and we were having blowout screaming matches daily. Usually after we fought, he would storm out of the house and disappear for hours at a time, or come back the next morning. It was a relief. I started to actually look forward to our fights because it would get him away from us for a while. After the birth of our daughter, my relationship with my son was almost entirely gone, our only real interactions were screaming at each other. My wife was even worse with him, she just had nothing left. By that time, if our son even came into the same room as her, she would just stop whatever she was doing and start screaming, "Get away from me. Get away. Get out." Until he left. He started spending more and more time out of the house, which was a blessing for us. I have no idea what he got up to out in the world, but we were just happy it wasn't being inflicted on us. As a consequence of our son's behavior, we had invested heavily in locks around our house. All of the cheap, thin interior doors in our home had been replaced with thick, dense wood doors that couldn't be kicked through, equipped with keyed locks that my wife and I carried keys to. I know it sounds extreme, but locks and heavy doors were the best way we had found to create safe spaces from him. And again, before I am inundated with messages, I was not locking my son in rooms like a prisoner, he had free reign of the house and could come and go as he pleased. My wife and I would lock ourselves in rooms to protect ourselves from him, if anything we were the prisoners in our own home. On the day in question, I had fought with my son in the morning and he had left the house in a rage. My wife and I were enjoying some peace and quiet in the kitchen while our daughter napped in our bedroom. And then my daughter began crying. Any parent who has young children can tell you, you get used to your child's cries and you can tell after a while what they need. They cry differently if they are hungry, or need changing, or are just restless and want to be held. Babies can communicate pretty well before they can speak. This cry was none of those things. This cry was terror. The second we heard it, my wife and I were both up out of our chairs and running to the room. The door was locked, of course, and it took a few seconds to get the right key and get it open. My son was in the room. We lived in a bungalow, and he had climbed in the window to get to her. He was standing over her crib with a steak knife in his hand. I have no idea where he got it, it wasn't one of ours, we controlled our knives very carefully and always kept them in locked drawers. I think he may have stolen it from one of our neighbors' houses. He had harmed her skin twice already, once in the belly area and once on her arm. I could see blood running down. When I entered the room he was dragging the back of the knife down her face, not cutting, almost tickling her with it, teasing her while she screamed. He looked up at us and smiled. Before I knew what I was doing, I was already moving, running to put myself between them. I didn't think about it, I just moved instinctively. Even with that, my wife got there faster, it was like a movie on fast forward. She got to our son and bashed his hand away, knocking the knife across the room and then shoved him with her whole body weight, so hard that he flew away from the crib and bounced off the wall. I picked up my daughter and held her while my wife screened us. I could see her shaking, almost convulsing. I can remember the smell of the room, the sound of my daughter screaming and wailing. The look on my son's face as he stood there. Just nothing. Blank, dead, there was nothing in his eyes, no emotion. He looked like an alien to me. I watched my wife take a step toward him. I could have reached out and stopped her, but I didn't. She stepped forward again, very close to him. I could have stopped her again. But I didn't. She waited, looking at him for maybe 3 to 5 seconds without moving. And then she struck him in the face. Now until this point, you may have been picturing my wife as a typical woman, small frame, dainty, delicate. This is not the case. My wife does have a small frame, but dainty and delicate she is not, never has been since I've known her. Since her early teens, my wife has been a boxer. MMA didn't exist back then, but karate and boxing were big in those days, and my wife was a very talented amateur. She was about 130 pounds, she carried a lot of muscle and she knew how to fight. I had 70 pounds on her back then, and I have no doubt that in a real fight between me and her she could have and would have beaten me. Neither of us had ever laid a hand on our son in anger before, but something broke in her that day, and all the years of anger and pain and sorrow and frustration just came pouring out. When she hit him his head snapped back and blood started pouring out of his nose. He hardly reacted, He just looked at her with this shocked expression like he didn't know how to process what had just happened. She waited another second. And then she hit him again. I could have reached out and stopped her. I could have dragged her out of the room, taken her away, calmed her. I didn't. I just stood there and watched while she systematically started to hurt him badly. Every time he brought his hands to cover one part, she would strike him somewhere else, body, head, over and over. He started screaming, crying out, yelling for her to stop. It's the most genuine reaction I'd ever seen him have to anything in his whole life. But she wasn't stopping. I watched her ramping up, hitting harder, faster, working him like a heavy bag. He tried to swing at her and she dodged him easily. She was on autopilot, sinking down into her training. I stood there watching for a minute. Then I turned my back on them and took my daughter out of the room. I brought my daughter to the kitchen and gave her a bath in the sink. I found that he had cut her a third time on the sole of her foot. All the cuts were superficial. I cleaned her up and held her until she calmed. I put antibiotic ointment and bandages on her cuts. In our bedroom, I could hear my son screaming, calling my wife horrible names, telling her he would harm her severely. After a while, I didn't hear him saying anything anymore, didn't even hear him crying out. I assumed that he must have been knocked out. But I could still hear her hurting him. That went on for a long time. Long enough for my daughter to drift off to sleep in my arms. I just sat at the kitchen table waiting for her to finish. Finally she came out and sat down across from me. Her hands were swollen and red. Her face and arms were splattered with blood. Her chest was heaving. We just stared at each other without saying anything. After a while I asked her, "Is he dead?" She looked back at me and answered, "I hope so." I nodded. That was all there was to say about that. I understood how she felt perfectly. I felt the same. I didn't know what to do, so we just sat there waiting silently. Eventually my wife started crying and went to go take a shower. I just stayed where I was holding our daughter. After a long while, I heard moaning and sobbing coming from our room. It turned out that my son wasn't dead. I went in to see how bad it was, and it was pretty bad. I've never seen a more merciless beating laid onto anyone, before or since. He was lying on the floor, rolling around with blood leaking out of his face, lying in a pool of bodily fluids. His nose was squashed flat out across his face, both of his eyes were completely swollen shut and starting to blacken already. I could see that a couple of his fingers were bent out at weird angles and he had soiled himself. I think he must have been missing teeth, but I couldn't see any on the floor and I couldn't see inside his mouth. His lips were all puffed up and swollen. From talking to my wife about it later, I know now that she had systematically hurt every part of his body, focusing heavily on his legs. She told me she kicked him repeatedly until her legs got tired, and had kept hurting his body long after he had passed out. When my wife came out of the shower, I still didn't know what to do about our son. I didn't know whether to call the police or an ambulance, take him to the hospital myself. I honestly didn't have any idea what to do. After a while I realized that I simply didn't care what happened to him anymore, and we decided to just let him live or die on his own. There was an in-law suite in the basement that we had never really used, and my wife, my daughter and I just moved down there. We simply ceded the top floor of the house to my son and locked everything down, separated our lives entirely. Next story. I can't believe I am actually typing this out right now, it's making it feel very real. And before you say it, I know. I am probably one of the worst human beings on this planet. Around a year ago, my older sister, 27, widowed mother of 2 boys, 8 and 5, decided to, against every single warning made, get extremely intoxicated and wreck her car into a rock embankment outside of our town. She was life-flighted to an ICU, spent weeks in a coma and awoke in vegetative state. In the past year, she has slowly began to see some progress. Because of this accident, I was forced to quit my job, leave my friends, move across the country and back in with my parents, to help take care of her and raise my nephews. I love them dearly, but I have never wanted to have kids, especially not forced upon me like this. She had the mind of a child now, argues about silly things, can't cook for herself, cries over everything, can't read, memory loss, partially paralyzed on her right side, has aphasia, and a list of other problems with me as her caregiver. She tell me how happy she is to be alive after such a bad car accident. I want to scream that I wish she would have died. Her boys are a wreck after losing their dad recently and now having a severely impaired mom. My parents are spending all of their retirement savings for her treatments. I can see the years getting shaved off my dad and mom from the stress. I don't treat her any differently, I still tell her stories and laugh with her and do my best, but I hate the way I feel when I look at her. Did you even think about your boys when you got in your car? She is smiling and completely ignorant to the pain she has caused to my entire family. So I guess that's it. That's my confession. I have a deep dark hatred and resentment for someone I love. And I will never let her know. Next story. I'm leaving the world, but I haven't told anyone. I was diagnosed with the big C a little over 2 weeks ago, after a regular checkup. Turns out I have a tumor on my colon that has spread to other areas, liver and lungs, so far, and will require extensive chemo and surgery for any chance to live longer than 8 months. I'm not having any treatment, and I haven't told my wife because she'll only pressure me to get the treatment, which results in months of pain and suffering for a relatively small chance. Instead, I'm making sure our last few months together are filled with only happy memories. I'm starting work later and finishing earlier each day, to make her breakfast in bed and take her on dates in the evenings. My landlord, I rent my workshop from, has agreed to let me run my business, rent-free, for the next 6 months. Which means significantly less financial stress, and I can save a lot more, so she has something to carry her over afterwards. I hope she'll forgive me for taking this path. Next story. My ex and I divorced 6 years ago. It was an unpleasant divorce. Our sons are now 9 and 13. We live 2 miles apart and we get the kids 1 week on, 1 week off. After the divorce, we had no real meaningful relationship other than talking about the kids, scheduling and stuff. I had no idea or interest in her personal life and she was the same with me. This last year, she started acting strange. She started being more chatty and friendly with me. I wasn't interested in having a social relationship with her. On Monday, I picked the kids up from school for my week with them and she texted me around 8 p.m. saying how I was the only person who she trusted 100% with the kids and I was a great dad and she thanked me for it. Then she told me to tell the boys that she loved them. That was unusual because she would call my eldest to say goodnight every night that they were with me, but didn't on that night. I drive by her place on my way to work and noticed her car was still parked on the street, but assumed she was working from home or sick. I had texted her in the morning about picking up my son's school book that he left at her house and hours had passed with no reply. That was very strange because she would reply within minutes if it had something to do with the kids. I started to grow a bit worried and called her. Again, I know nothing about her social life so it wasn't like I could call her friends because I don't know any of them and her parents live out of state. I left a voicemail telling her that if she didn't call or text me back by 2 p.m. then I was going to her house to make sure she was okay. I left work early and went to her house. There were packages at her door which was another red flag. She would never leave packages unattended outside. I called, texted and knocked at the door and there was no response. I let myself in and called out for her. I went into her bedroom and saw this body with a large blood stain on her shirt and something that looked like a phone in her hand. That wasn't a phone, it was a weapon. And she had unalived herself. I called the authorities, and they questioned me for 3 hours, telling me they would reach out to her parents, as I was no longer next of kin. I had to pick up my kids and kept a stone face, as I was still processing the situation. On Wednesday, my eldest started complaining that his mom was not replying to his text messages and demanded that I take him to her house, which is still all taped up. He thinks she's ignoring his texts or that her phone is broken and wants to tell her to fix it. I asked to speak with his principal in private, and told him that he would be missing school next week. He asked, what in the world could be so important that he should miss a week of school? I told him, his mom just unalived herself the other day, and I haven't told him yet. Her mom has been calling me constantly, asking to speak to the boys, but I told her I haven't told them yet because things have been moving too quickly. My eldest is picking up that something has happened, and now the 9-year-old is picking up vibes too. My 13-year-old is demanding that we go to his mom's and even threatened to ditch school if I didn't do it. The 9-year-old wouldn't let me drop him off at school and had a meltdown. I decided to tell them what happened Saturday because I am not prepared to deal with the madness coming my way. My 13-year-old will be extremely upset. Update, we laid his mom to rest 3 days ago. He was already slim, but now he looks physically ill. His socks slipped down his feet. I thought about taking him to a psychiatric hospital, but the only ones nearby are for adults struggling with substance abuse and or have no open beds, and I don't think psychiatric medication is going to help anyways. That's it for now. See you in the next post.